I have with me Achim Steiner, the UNDP administrator, who's here in India. Many thanks for speaking with NDTV. The mandate of the UNDP is to end poverty, to have democratic governance in place and a rules-based order. Considering that the Ukraine war has been on after a post-COVID situation, it's piling misery on a large population in the world. What role can the UNDP play in finding a solution to these problems, and can it bear upon the parent body, the UN, to bring about a solution to end the war?
Well, let me begin by saying that the parent body, the United Nations, is led by the Secretary General, who is obviously engaged on this issue almost day and night. And in that sense, both the Security Council, the Secretary General, are the political fora in which the broader context within which what is happening to Ukraine and in Ukraine is now being addressed. UNDP's role as a development organization at this moment is, first of all, to provide a development emergency support program. Principally, that is to help the government to maintain the functionality of its government infrastructure and also of services, because citizens have been displaced across the country, but much of Ukraine is still a country that is governed and essentially serviced by the government of Ukraine. But obviously under the continuous attacks, the destruction of infrastructure, the mining of many of the settlements, it creates enormous challenges. So our work is particularly focused on helping the government, for example, with digital platforms to enable to provide continuous services to citizens, to lead the mine action service that the international community is providing to Ukraine with its own staff that are clearing landmines. And it is a massive minefield that has now been created across Ukraine. And also to look very quickly at livelihood opportunities. How do we help small businesses and entrepreneurs who maybe have lost their workshop, their bakery, their business, to quickly rebuild and be able to earn a livelihood? Because millions of people have become internally displaced in addition to the millions who have become refugees.
But Achim Steiner, it's not only the fact that work needs to be done on the ground, but there is a growing divide now between the Western countries and China and Russia on the other side. China supporting Russia on that count. And we saw a glimpse of that in Bengaluru, where you were representing the United Nations. Is it a setback that when an outcome document with regards to debt restructuring for vulnerable countries is put out, there is differences on the text of the Ukraine war?
Well, let me first of all say two things. First of all, the G20 only functions when 20 countries are willing to come around the table and take decisions together. So I think since last year, we have seen that the geopolitical and the geoeconomic tensions clearly are also obstructing and constraining the G20's role, which is particularly in crisis, to enable the world's leading economies that account for almost 80% of global economic activity to come together and find fast responses. Clearly that is not happening on a scale that is needed right now, whether it's on debt issues, whether it is on reform of international financial architecture. But secondly, it is also clear that we are living in a period where these fractures are becoming more pronounced. And in the communique, however, that has come out of the Finance Ministers Central Bank Governors meeting in Bengaluru, there are 2 paragraphs on which there was no agreement, and there are 17 or 18 paragraphs on which agreement was reached in principle. So at this stage of the G20 presidency that India has assumed, I would say it is not ideal to not have a communique, but I think we can also see where the disagreements were and where agreements have emerged, including on World Bank reform, on the infrastructure, on sustainable financing, and to some extent also on debt issues. So let's in a sense keep a perspective that it is always going to be a matter of negotiation, because the G20 have never been unified in a singular set of interests.
Finally, during the summit, the G20 summit, the leaders' declaration has to be done basis a consensus. In the run-up to that, how big a challenge is it for India now? And we are also going to be hosting the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting this week. Do you see it as a huge challenge now for India from here on till September in being able to get consensus going?
I think given everything that we can observe in the global political arena, yes, I think without doubt, we already owe a debt of gratitude to Indonesia to, in a sense, have managed to rescue the G20 last year, because there were moments when we may not have had this platform anymore. I think India's presidency from the beginning has set itself a very strong objective of providing room for convergence, for identifying where shared interests allow the G20 to actually act in the interests of the global family of nations, because what we are witnessing right now are still multiple crises unfolding. In UNDP's latest report on, for example, debt, we see 52 countries a step away from being in debt distress. These are not being adequately answered to. The international financial system is not mounting an appropriate scaled response. This is extremely risky for many developing nations, and so the G20 needs to, throughout this year, arrive at a series of actions that address the interests of developing nations, the interests of an international economy, and of a financial system.
And when you have a big crisis like the Ukraine war, does that put on the back burner other important issues that the G20 should also be addressing, like climate finance and climate justice, something that India wants to push in its G20 presidency? Do you see the risk of that being on the back burner?
Well, I think the simple truth holds. Nations divided do not act as effectively as nations united. So I think we have to acknowledge that these setbacks may occur, although interesting enough, the element of energy insecurity and energy price rises that have arisen not only on the back of the war in Ukraine, but also in the general economic disruption that we have seen, in some ways has also accelerated in many countries now the deployment of renewable energy infrastructure. So I think what we will see 2-3 years from now is a very steep, significant increase in terms of energy transitions. So the G20 can now reinforce this, or it can, in a sense, ignore it. And I think this is where India's presidency, again, has been very clear. It has committed itself to taking the issue of climate change and development, climate and finance, and put it at the center also of the G20 agenda. And I think the world deserves nothing less, because this is a critical period. And so I would consider this year's G20 presidency as, yes, being distracted and in some ways being hampered also by the divisions that exist, but in some areas, particularly with the G20 presidency leading with very clear priorities, also being able to bring some common action to the fore. And I think that is very much the hope.
You referred to a UNDP report with regards to the 52 vulnerable countries. Some of them are in India's neighborhood, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. What is the assessment of the UNDP on the regional stability looking at the situation?
You know, sometimes when in the big picture of the finance minister, central bank governors, one looks at macroprudential issues and financial stability, one might say that these 52 countries don't account necessarily for a vast part of the global GDP. In fact, these 52 countries might be between 3 to 5% of global GDP. But we look at it through a different lens. In the United Nations, we look at the fact that these are 40% of the world's poorest people. This is 25 countries that are amongst the most climate vulnerable countries. We just spoke about Pakistan. We remember those catastrophic floods last year. What is quite evident is that when a financial crisis turns into an economic crisis, when a default becomes a very real prospect, immediately this has effects on the political and social stability of a country. So we should be extremely concerned about the current debt levels, about the risk of debt distress, and what happens to societies when a government can no longer afford to import fuel, guarantee food security. Societies very quickly begin to break apart, and it becomes a factor that drives instability and insecurity.
My final question, Achim Steiner, is with regards to the devastating earthquake, that we've seen in Turkey and in Syria. Syria especially, aid could not reach quickly there because of sanctions. What is your and the UN's view on sanctions of this nature, which end up increasing the misery of the general public rather than, punishing a regime?
Well, let me just say that the challenges of bringing support to the victims of this earthquake in Syria were in part because of the sanction, but also in part because access was very constrained. As you know, there was only one border post, and that particular border post was also affected by the earthquake, again in terms of the road and the transport possibilities. But the UN, obviously, every hour that passes after an earthquake is an hour too long for aid to arrive. But I would still argue with our emergency relief coordinator, Martin Griffiths, and others, we deployed as quickly as we could. We then also negotiated with Syria and the international community opening up 2 more cross-border points, and so aid is now coming in. But let's be clear, Syria has been frozen in a tragic impasse over the conflict within Syria, multiple foreign armies that are there, multiple terrorist organizations operating there. It's a nightmare, and the balance sheet, if you look just at the cost of this conflict and this continued inability to resolve it, is that over 90%, probably 95% of Syrians now live below the poverty line. It's a terrible situation, and particularly where the earthquake happened, people already were in survival mode. So in many ways, I think it is a tragic reminder of what war causes, what civil strife can cause, and how it paralyzes our ability to operate. I think right now for the humanitarian operation, we have appealed, the Secretary General and many of us, that we should not let sanctions and politics in any way constrain the response. I think it is also a reminder that we must find a way out of the current impasse in Syria. That is as much the responsibility of the Syrian leadership as it is also that of the international community.
Achim Steiner, many thanks for speaking with NDTV.
Thank you.